imagine a track meet. Let's say it's the 5,000-meter final at the Olympics. And in lane 1, you have a runner. We'll call him Israel.
Okay.
And this guy is the ultimate athlete. I mean, he has been training for this specific race for literally 2,000 years. He has the strictest diet, the most rigorous training regimen, the best coaches in history. You know, Moses, David, the prophets.
The dream team of coaches.
Exactly. He knows every single inch of the track.
Yeah.
So the gun goes off, and he runs with just absolute terrifying fury. Sweat is pouring down his face. His muscles are straining. He is obeying every rule of the sport to absolute perfection because he is obsessed with the finish line.
He's doing everything right.
Everything. But then you have a guy up in the stands,
Mm-hmm.
and let's call him Gentile. He's eating a chili dog. He's wearing jeans. He didn't even bring running shoes because he didn't even know there was a race today. He has zero interest in running. He's just looking for a place to sit down.
Just completely checked out.
Right. And then the paradox happens. The runner, Israel, who is sprinting with everything he has, trips over his own feet and face plants into the tarmac just inches from the finish line. Meanwhile, the guy in the bleachers, Gentile, somehow miraculously, inexplicably, finds himself standing on the winner's podium with the gold medal around his neck.
That is a vivid and frankly kind of a disturbing image, but it captures perfectly the scandal that Paul opens with in Romans chapter 9, verse 30. It's the whole race metaphor turned completely upside down.
It makes absolutely no sense. I mean, the people trying the hardest lost, and people who weren't even trying, who didn't even know the rules, won.
And that provocation is exactly where Paul wants us. He wants you to feel the shock, the unfairness of that paradox. How does religious zeal trying really, really hard to obey God actually lead to a lack of righteousness? How does effort become a stumbling block?
That is the cliffhanger we are standing on today. Welcome to the Deep Dive. We are back in our Theology Brain series, going chapter by chapter through the book of Romans. I'm Jordan.
And I'm Alex.
And today, we are tackling Romans chapter 10. This is the chapter where Paul tries to explain that race, why the runner stumbled, and why the spectator won. And to help us do that, we have our usual stack of heavy-hitting commentaries.
We certainly do. We are looking at Thomas Schreiner's work in the Baker Exegetical series, Douglas Moo's classic commentary in the NICNT, and Beverly Roberts' Gaventa from the New Testament Library.
3 scholars, 3 very different ways of looking at this text. So before we get into the weeds of the Greek, and there are some serious weeds today, orient us, we just finished chapter 9, which was heavy.
Heavy is an understatement.
Predestination, pottery, Pharaoh, it was a lot. Where are we now in the argument?
We are right in the center of what scholars call the 9 to 11 triad. This whole section is dealing with the problem of Israel.
And just to clarify for everyone listening, the problem isn't that Israel is annoying or something. The problem is deeply theological.
Right. The problem is a massive dilemma. If God chose these people, gave them the promises, the covenants, the law, why aren't they believing in their own Messiah? If the gospel is true, Israel should have been the first in line, but they're rejecting it.
Which naturally raises the terrifying question, did God fail?
Exactly. And chapter 9 gave us the answer from the side of divine sovereignty. God chooses whom he chooses. He is the potter, we are the clay. It was a very top-down view. But chapter 10 pivots, the camera angle changes completely. Now we're looking at human responsibility.
So chapter 9 is God chose, and chapter 10 is Israel refused.
Precisely. And it's important to note, as Douglas Moo points out in his commentary, that this section, Romans 9 through 11, isn't an excursus.
An excursus being like a tangent or a sidebar.
Right. For a long time, people treated these chapters like a parenthesis. Like Paul took a break from his main argument about salvation to just vent about his kinsmen. But Moo argues that this is actually the climax of the letter. Paul has spent 8 chapters explaining the gospel, and now he has to test that gospel against the hard reality of history.
That makes total sense. Because if God's promises to Israel failed, why on earth should you trust his promises to you in chapter 8? If nothing can separate us from the love of God, but Israel got separated, then maybe God isn't actually trustworthy.
That is the high-stakes gamble of these chapters. So chapter 10 is the bridge. It transitions us from the righteousness of the law, which Israel was aggressively pursuing, to the righteousness of faith, which is universally offered to everyone. No distinction, as Paul says.
Okay, let's meet our guides for this journey. We have Schreiner, Moo, and Gaventa. We need to do our commentary DNA check. Who are these people, and how do they read the Bible? Because they are definitely not reading it the same way.
Let's start with Thomas Schreiner. He represents the redemptive, historical, and reformed perspective.
Now, redemptive historical is a mouthful. If I had to explain that to my neighbor, What am I actually saying?
Think of it like a movie franchise with very distinct eras. Like Star Wars, you have the Republic era, the Empire era, the New Republic. The rules that applied in one era don't necessarily apply in the next.
Okay, I track with that.
So for Schreiner, the law is primarily the Sinai covenant. It's the contract God made with Moses. And his big point is that contract is over. The credits have rolled on that movie.
So he draws a hard line.
A very hard line. He's looking at the timeline of salvation history. When Paul talks about works of law, Schreiner interprets that as a negative attempt to earn salvation. He calls it establishing their own righteousness. He views the law as a ladder that Israel was trying to climb, and Christ came to permanently take the ladder away.
Okay, so Schreiner is a covenant lawyer. He's checking the dates on the contract. What about Douglas Moo?
Moo is what I'd call the synthesizer. He's a classical evangelical scholar, and he is extremely careful. If Schreiner is the architect drawing sharp, definitive lines, Moo is the diplomat. He is deeply concerned with the continuity of Scripture. He wants to defend Paul against the charge that he's just abandoning the Old Testament.
So Moo sees more of a connection between the Old and New than Schreiner might.
To a degree, yes. Moo sees Romans 9 through 11 as a correction of two specific errors. First, Jewish presumption, thinking they deserve salvation because of their heritage. And second, Gentile arrogance, thinking they somehow replaced Israel. He balances that tension. He's always looking for the exegetical middle ground.
And then we have Beverly Roberts Gaventa. She's the wild card here. She's writing for the New Testament Library series.
She absolutely is. Her lens is apocalyptic.
Apocalyptic usually makes me think of zombies, nuclear fallout,
Yeah.
the Left Behind books. I assume that's not what you mean in an academic theological context.
Right, no zombies here. In theology, apocalyptic refers to God's invasive action. It means the world is held captive by dark powers, sin and death with capital letters. And God literally invades the cosmos to set it right.
So for her, righteousness isn't just a legal status or a moral standing.
Not at all. Think of it this way. Schreiner sees salvation as a courtroom. You are either guilty or innocent. Gaventa sees salvation as a battlefield or a hostage rescue. For Gaventa, righteousness is God's power to rectify the world. She reads Paul as doing something very radical with Scripture. She talks about re-referentialization.
That is definitely a $10 word. Re-referentialization.
It's a mouthful. It essentially means taking a text that referred to one thing and making it refer to something else entirely. She thinks Paul isn't just quoting the Old Testament, he's remixing it. She downplays the doing of the law and highlights the event of Christ.
Okay, so we have the covenantalist in Schreiner, the synthesizer in Moo, and the apocalyptic radical in Gaventa. Let's turn the loose on the text. We start with the diagnosis of zeal. This is Romans 9:30 through 10:4.
Let's look at the actual text. Paul writes, "Brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God for them is that they may be saved. For I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge."
That phrase, zeal for God, zelos theou in the Greek. All three of our commentators seem to agree on one thing right out of the gate here. Israel is not lazy.
Right. That's the minimum consensus.
Yeah.
Paul is not calling his kinsmen hypocrites. He isn't saying they are slacking off or sleeping in on the Sabbath. They are zealous. They are that runner sprinting until his lungs burn.
Which honestly makes the tragedy so much worse. If they were just lazy, you could say, well, try harder next time, put in some effort.
Yeah.
But they are trying as hard as humanly possible.
Exactly. But they are running in the wrong direction. The divergence between our scholars comes when we ask, what exactly is the nature of their error? Why is their zeal bad?
Schreiner would say it's legalism, right? That's the classic Protestant Reformation reading.
Yes. Schreiner is very clear on this. He argues that Israel's error was seeking to establish their own righteousness, which Paul mentions in 10:3. They viewed the law as a means to put God in their debt.
Like a transaction.
Exactly. If I do X, Y, and Z, God owes me salvation. It's a purely performance-based relationship.
So they are essentially trying to build a tower to heaven, brick, by their own moral effort.
Correct. And because of sin, the tower always collapses. It's structurally unsound from the start.
But Gaventa pushes back on this pretty hard, doesn't she? She doesn't like the legalism label at all.
No, she really doesn't. She argues that reading first-century Judaism as a religion of legalism is a massive caricature. She shifts the focus entirely. She says the error isn't just a moral flaw of pride or trying to earn brownie points. It's a refusal to submit to God's righteousness.
Submit is the key word there. What's the practical difference between trying to earn something and refusing to submit?
Think back to her apocalyptic lens, the invasion. For Gaventa, God's righteousness is the cosmic event of the cross. God has invaded history in Jesus to set things right. Israel's error is that they are continuing with business as usual.
They're ignoring the invasion.
Right. They're holding on to the temple, the Torah, the traditions, while refusing to recognize that the fundamental fabric of the universe has changed.
Oh, I really like that distinction. So Schreiner's saying you're trying to pay for a gift that is completely free, but Gaventa is saying the king has entered the building and you're still ignoring him to focus on the rulebook.
Exactly. It's not just trying to earn points. It is a cosmic insubordination. They are flatly refusing to recognize the new regime.
That brings us to one of the most famous and frankly debated verses in the entire book of Romans, chapter 10, verse 4. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes.
The word end, telos in Greek, this is the absolute battleground of this chapter.
We have to stop here because this one word, telos, carries so much theological weight. Does it mean the end, like termination, finish line, game over? Or does it mean the goal, like the purpose, the point, the target you're aiming at?
It's a massive debate. Because if you say it means termination, you sound like you're saying the Old Testament doesn't matter anymore. And that creates an immediate practical problem.
Right. Someone's going to say, wait, can I just go murder people now because the law against murder is terminated?
Exactly. But on the flip side, if you say it just means goal, like Christ is what the law was aiming at, you might be downplaying the radical change that just happened. You might be saying, well, the law is still fully in effect. Christ just helps us do it better.
So where does Schreiner land in that minefield?
Yeah.
Because he's the redemptive historical guy.
I'm sure you can guess.
I'm guessing he leans heavily toward termination.
He pulls a bit of a both and, but yes, with a very heavy lean toward termination. He says Christ is the goal the law pointed to, like the law was a signpost pointing to a grand city. But once you actually reach the city, you don't need the signpost anymore.
That makes intuitive sense. You don't stand there and hug the signpost. You go into the destination.
But then he drops the hammer. He says, quote, the law was set aside as a covenant. He emphasizes that the Mosaic covenant, the specific contract of do this and live, is over. It is terminated.
That is incredibly strong language set aside. So for Schreiner, the law as a binding covenant is a closed book.
It is. But Gaventa takes a totally different route. She de-emphasizes the whole law versus gospel debate entirely. She focuses on the result. She points out that the verse says Christ is the end of the law, resulting in righteousness.
So for her, the main point isn't about the legal status of the Torah itself, but about what Christ actually accomplishes.
Exactly. She says the end isn't just chronological, it's the outcome. Christ brings about the actual righteousness that the law could talk about, but could never actually produce in humans.
It seems like Schreiner's looking at the contract, and Gaventa's looking at the power. Like Schreiner is asking, is the contract still legally valid? And Gaventa is asking who actually has the power to fix the broken world.
That's a great way to put it. And honestly, both concepts are true in Paul's broader theology, but they emphasize vastly different aspects of this one verse.
Let's move to the next section, verses 5 through 8, because this is where Paul does some, let's call it exegetical gymnastics.
That is a very polite way to put it. I mean, if I turned in a seminary paper using the Old Testament the way Paul uses it right here, my Old Testament professor would fail me on the spot.
Let's read it so you, the listener, can hear the sheer weirdness of what Paul is doing. He writes in verse 5, for Moses writes about the righteousness that is based on the law, that the person who does the commandments shall live by them.
That is a direct quote from Leviticus 18, verse 5.
Right. And then in the very next breath, verse 6, he says, but the righteousness based on faith says. And then he starts quoting Deuteronomy 30. Do not say in your heart, who will ascend into heaven, that is, to bring Christ down, or who will descend into the abyss, that is, to bring Christ up from the dead.
So he deliberately sets Leviticus against Deuteronomy.
Is he seriously pitting Moses against Moses? It sounds like he's framing Leviticus as the bad guy and Deuteronomy as the good guy.
That is exactly how Schreiner reads it. He sees a very sharp contrast here. Leviticus 18 represents the law principle. Do and live. If you want to be saved by the law, you have to do it perfectly.
Which Paul has already established is utterly impossible.
Right, because of Romans 3:23. All have sinned. So for Schreiner, Leviticus 18 is a dead end. It's a theoretical possibility that is practically impossible for fallen humans. It's like saying, you can survive jumping off a cliff if you just flap your arms hard enough. Theoretically, maybe. Practically. Splat.
Splat. Okay, so Leviticus is the cliff. What is Deuteronomy doing there then?
Schreiner says Paul reads Deuteronomy 30 redemptive historically. He sees it as a prophecy of the new covenant. Even though Moses originally wrote it about the law being accessible, Paul sees it pointing forward to the time when God would actually circumcise hearts and make faith possible.
Okay, so Schreiner sees a contrast between doing a Leviticus and believing in Deuteronomy. But Gaventa looks at this and calls it re-referentialization. And this is where the gymnastics get wild.
Yes. Gaventa points out that Paul isn't just interpreting Deuteronomy here. He is aggressively rewriting it. He is basically editing the Bible.
Walk us through the edit. What exactly does he change?
Okay, so open your mental Bibles back to the original context of Deuteronomy 30. Moses is talking about the commandment, the law. He says to Israel, the commandment is not too hard for you. It is not up in heaven, neither is it beyond the sea.
Okay, so it is clearly the law.
Now look at Romans 10. Paul quotes it, but he actively deletes the word law and inserts Christ.
He literally just swaps the nouns out.
He does. He completely hijacks the passage and makes it about Christ. And then he changes the geography too. Deuteronomy 30 asks, who will cross the sea? Historically referring to the Red Sea. But Paul changes it to, who will descend into the abyss?
Why change the sea to the abyss?
To make it fit the resurrection. The abyss is the realm of the dead. So Paul takes a passage originally about the accessibility of the Torah and forces it into a passage about the incarnation and resurrection of Jesus.
That is incredibly bold. I mean, he is taking a text about keeping the Torah and making it speak about Jesus replacing the Torah.
Gaventa says it's radical. She says Paul is showing that the word that is near us isn't a text we have to obey anymore. It is the cosmic event of Christ.
So let's look at the theological significance of this edit. Why does Paul do this? What's he trying to tell us?
He's dismantling the whole concept of the heroic journey.
The heroic journey.
Think about religion generally. Across almost all cultures, religion is a quest. You have to climb the treacherous mountain to find the wise guru. You have to cross the scorching desert to find the holy shrine. You have to somehow ascend to heaven to find God. It's all about human effort reaching upward.
And Deuteronomy asks, who will go up to heaven?
And Paul says, don't ask that. That is trying to bring Christ down. You don't have to climb a moral or mystical ladder to find God. God already came down. That's the incarnation.
And then who will go down to the abyss?
Paul says, don't ask that either. That's trying to raise Christ up. You don't have to play the ultimate hero and rescue Jesus from the grave. God already raised him. That is the resurrection.
This is so profound. Paul is saying that the two absolute hardest things in the universe, touching God in heaven and defeating death in hell, have already been done for you.
Exactly. We are not the active agents in salvation. God is. We don't have to climb up or dig down. The heavy lifting is finished.
So if I don't have to climb up to get God, and I don't have to dig down into the abyss to find him, where is he?
Verse 8, the word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart. God has already done the movement. He came down, he came up, and now he is as close as your own breath.
That is a beautiful transition from doing to receiving. It's the difference between trying to build a bridge over a chasm yourself and just walking across a bridge that's already been built for you.
It really is. And Schreiner would emphasize that this nearness is the end of the impossible demand of the law. You don't have to do the impossible anymore. Well, Gaventa would emphasize that this nearness is the invasive, inescapable presence of the gospel. God has invaded your personal space.
Which leads us directly to the content of this word of faith. We are in verses 9 through 13 now, because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved.
This is likely one of the absolute earliest Christian creeds. Long before the Nicene Creed, before the Apostles' Creed, there was just this. Kyrios Asisus.
Jesus is Lord. 2 words in Greek, but infinite implications.
Schreiner really emphasizes the divinity aspect here. He notes that down in verse 13, Paul quotes Joel chapter 2, verse 32. Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved.
Now, in the original context of Joel, Lord is Yahweh, the Tetragrammaton, the holy unpronounceable name of the Creator God of Israel.
Exactly. And Paul takes that name, that specific divine title, and slaps it right onto Jesus of Nazareth.
That is a staggering Christology. You cannot get higher than that.
To confess Jesus as Lord is to identify a crucified first-century carpenter with the Creator of the universe. It is a massive, paradigm-shifting claim.
And Moo points out the political angle here too, right? Because there was another Lord on the block in the first century.
Yes, there definitely was. In the Roman world, there was only one person you confessed as Lord in a public, binding way. Caesar, Kaiser Kyrios. So to stand up and say Jesus is Lord was implicitly saying, and Caesar is not.
So it's high treason and high theology wrapped in one breath.
It is the ultimate statement of allegiance. But notice the scope of this allegiance. Verse 11, everyone who believes. Verse 12, there is no distinction between Jew and Greek. Verse 13, everyone who calls.
The word all, pass in Greek, just keeps hammering like a drumbeat through this text.
Schreiner calls this the death knell of Jewish exclusivism. The distinction is permanently gone. The dividing wall is down. And
Gaventa points out something really interesting here about Paul's use of Isaiah, doesn't she?
She does. She notes that when Paul quotes Isaiah 28:16 in verse 11, where it says, everyone who believes in him will not be put to shame, Paul actually adds the word everyone.
He adds it, like it wasn't there.
The original Hebrew text doesn't explicitly use the word everyone, though it's certainly implied in the broader context. But Paul adds it explicitly in his Greek translation to make absolutely sure nobody misses the point. He is expanding the text to match the wideness of God's mercy.
He really wants to drive home that the ethnic boundary is erased.
It connects right back to your opening metaphor. Why did the Gentiles win the race? Not because they ran better, not because they trained harder, but because the stadium was suddenly thrown open to everyone who simply called out for help.
So we have this universal offer, but that creates a huge logistical problem. If salvation is for everyone, regardless of nationality, how do people actually find out about it? Which brings us to verses 14 through 17, the logic of mission.
This is the famous chain of salvation. Paul asks a series of rapid-fire rhetorical questions. How can they call on him if they don't believe? How can they believe if they haven't heard? How can they hear without a preacher? And how can they preach unless they are sent?
It's basically a reverse engineering of salvation.
Exactly. And Schreiner takes a very hard logical line here.
How so? What's his argument?
He argues this proves that natural revelation, just looking at the trees, the mountains, the stars, is not enough to save anyone. He cites back to Romans 1, where Paul says people know God exists from nature, but they suppress that truth in unrighteousness.
So watching a beautiful sunset can convict you that there's a creator, but it can't actually save you.
Exactly. General revelation is enough to condemn us because we ignore the creator it points to, but it's not enough to save us. For salvation, you need the specific message of Christ. You need the historical gospel.
So missions aren't just a nice program the church does. They are a strict theological necessity.
For Schreiner, yes, absolutely. If there is no preacher, there is no hearing. If there's no hearing, there's no faith. If there's no faith, there's no salvation. The chain is unbreakable.
But Gaventa adds a nuance to the idea of hearing. She focuses on the specific Greek word used, ako.
Yes, ako translates to report or news. She says faith comes from the report, which is the word of Christ. It's not just acoustic sound waves hitting your eardrum. It's the specific authoritative announcement of the lordship of Jesus.
So the word isn't just data to be processed. It's a summons.
Right. When a royal herald announces that the king has arrived, you don't just stand there and process the information intellectually. You either bow to knee or you rebel. It demands a response.
Which perfectly sets up the tragedy of the next section, verses 18 through 21. Because if the message is necessary to be saved, the defense lawyer for Israel would immediately stand up in court and say, objection. Maybe my client just didn't hear the message.
That is the emotional climax of the whole chapter. Paul has set up this beautiful, accessible salvation. It's near, it's for everyone. So the most natural defense for Israel's unbelief is maybe we just missed the memo.
And Paul shuts that down immediately in verse 18. He says, but I ask, have they not heard? Indeed they have. And then he quotes Psalm 19, verse 4. Their voice has gone out to all the earth, and their words to the ends of the world.
Wait, pause right there. Context check. What is Psalm 19 actually about?
The heavens declare the glory of God. It's entirely about the sun, the moon, the stars. It's about nature.
Correct. And this creates a huge debate among our commentators. Is Paul contradicting himself? He just said, according to Schreiner's reading, that nature doesn't save. But now he quotes a nature psalm to prove Israel heard the gospel.
That is confusing. Is he suddenly saying the stars actually preach the gospel of Jesus?
Schreiner says no way. Schreiner argues that Paul is using the language of the psalm hyperbolically. He's borrowing the poetic words to say, just as the sun shines everywhere, the apostolic preaching of the early church has gone everywhere.
So he's just using it as an illustration.
Right.
Like saying, the news spread like wildfire. He doesn't mean an actual physical fire burned the city down.
Right. Schreiner totally rejects the idea that this refers to natural revelation saving people. He holds the line firmly on the absolute necessity of human preaching.
Does Gaventa agree with that reading?
She agrees that Paul is referring to the apostolic preaching, the mission to the nations. But she sees a much deeper, more ironic connection back to Romans chapter 1. She thinks Paul is being very clever. The physical creation witnesses to God and humans refuse it. The apostles witness to Christ and Israel refuses it. It's a continuous pattern of willful rejection.
Wow. So the tragedy isn't silence, the tragedy is deafness.
Did Israel not understand? Paul asks. And he answers by calling Moses and Isaiah to the witness stand. Moses says, I will make you jealous of those who are not a nation.
That's the Gentiles,
Yeah.
the foolish nation in the stands.
Right. God is using the spectators and the bleachers to provoke the runners on the track. It's a divine jealousy plot.
And then he brings in Isaiah 65. I was found by those who did not seek me.
That's the Gentiles again, stumbling into gold medals they didn't train for.
But then we hit verse 21, and this is the real heartbreaker of the chapter. But of Israel, he says, all day long I've held out my hands to a disobedient and contrary people.
Moose synthesizes this beautifully. He says this single verse proves that the core problem isn't God's lack of effort. God isn't hiding. He isn't whispering so they can't hear. He is standing there, arms wide open, pleading all day long.
It's a haunting image. God is the spurned lover, or the parent just standing on the porch waiting for the prodigal who won't come home.
It is, and it leaves us with this massive unresolved tension. God is sovereign, we saw that in chapter 9, yet he is standing there waiting and being rejected in chapter 10. The mystery is how those two realities coexist in the mind of God.
All right, we've walked through the text. Now it's time for the commentary showdown. We have to pick a winner on the key interpretive battles of this chapter.
The main battleground is clearly the definition of the end of the law in 10:4 and the wild use of Deuteronomy in 10:6 through 8.
So in the red corner, we have Thomas Schreiner, the precisionist.
Schreiner's stance is definitive. The law is a covenant that is finished, over. Paul is contrasting doing versus believing. Leviticus 18 is the bad way of works, and Deuteronomy 30 is the prophecy of the good way of faith. His strength is his theological clarity. You know exactly where you stand with him. The era of law is over. The era of Christ has begun.
And in the blue corner, we have Beverly Roberts Gaventa, the radical reader.
Her stance is cosmic. She says Paul isn't just contrasting two ways of salvation like a theology textbook. He is showing God's explosive invasion into history. She thinks Schreiner sees a contrast in the text where Paul actually sees a hostile takeover. Paul silences the law in Deuteronomy to force it to speak about Christ. It's not just redemptive history, it's apocalyptic intrusion.
So who wins?
This is really tough. I think Gaventa wins on the literary observation.
I completely agree. You just can't deny that Paul is rewriting Deuteronomy. He is literally swapping words out.
Yeah.
If you try to read that as a straight contextual quote like Schreiner does, it feels incredibly forced. Paul is clearly doing something much wilder. He is remixing the text.
I agree. Her insight into re-referentialization explains the actual textual mechanics so much better. But I think Schreiner wins on the theological implication.
How so?
Because the final upshot of Paul's argument is that the law is no longer the path. Schreiner is right that Paul is shutting down the ladder-climbing approach to God. Whether Paul does it by contrast, as Schreiner says, or by apocalyptic invasion, as Gaventa says, the practical result for the believer is exactly the same. The only way to righteousness is submission to Christ.
So Gaventa gets the how, the method Paul uses, and Schreiner gets the Paul's ultimate conclusion.
That's a fair compromise. And Moo, as always, stands right in the middle, saying, can't we all just get along? The law is fulfilled and ended.
Let's try to boil all this down. What is the big idea of Romans 10 if we had to put it in one single memorable sentence?
If we synthesize all of this, I'd say Christ is the finish line of history in the law. Therefore, righteousness is no longer about climbing a ladder of doing, but about confessing the Lord who has already descended to us.
I really like that. Righteousness is not achieved by human effort, but received by submitting to God's action in Christ.
And that word submit is so key. Remember verse 3, they did not submit to God's righteousness. We usually think of faith as trust, which is warm and fuzzy, but Paul thinks of faith here as submission. It's laying down your weapons. It's laying down your impressive religious resume.
That brings us perfectly to the application bridge. How does this ancient text land for you, the modern Christian listening today?
I think the first massive application is what we can call the zeal trap.
We can be exactly like Israel.
Absolutely. We can have zeal without knowledge. You can be incredibly busy with church work, theological debates, social justice, moral performance. You can be running that race with sweat pouring down your face, thinking you are pleasing God.
Establishing your own righteousness. Look at what I did for you, God.
Exactly. Look at your life right now. Are you exhausted? Spiritual exhaustion is so often a sign that you are secretly trying to ascend to heaven to bring Christ down, or descend to the abyss to prove you are worthy. It's the grave danger of wanting to be right rather than just wanting to be rescued.
That is so good. Wanting to be right rather than rescued, it changes everything.
The second application is what we might call the scandal of ease.
The word is near.
We hate this. Honestly, we naturally hate this.
Why do we hate it? It sounds like good news.
Because we want to be heroes. If I told you to get right with God, you have to sell every single thing you own, crawl on your bleeding knees all the way to Jerusalem, and memorize the entire book of Leviticus, people would do it because then you did it. You achieved it. You could boast about it.
But Paul just says, confess with your mouth.
It's too easy. It is profoundly insulting to our human pride. It's just a sentence away.
Right.
It implies we are completely helpless beggars who just need to ask for charity. And that offends us so much more than a list of impossible rules.
That is profound. The gospel is offensive, not because it's too hard, but because it's too free.
Exactly. It strips you of your pride.
And what's the third application?
The urgency of speech.
Because of that unbreakable chain of salvation.
Right. If faith comes by hearing, then our speaking actually matters. This completely challenges that old popular cliche, preach the gospel at all times, use words if necessary.
Paul would absolutely hate that quote.
Paul would tear his garments over that quote. He would say words are absolutely necessary. How can they believe in whom they have not heard? You can't just mime the resurrection by being a nice person. You have to actually tell the historical story. We need to be the feet. How beautiful are the feet of those who preach good news?
Well, we are coming to the end of the deep dive today. But Paul leaves us with a massive cliffhanger.
He really does. Chapter 10 ends on a huge downer. Israel is obstinate, God's hands are held out, but they are turning away in defiance. And it looks like the whole promise of the Old Testament has failed.
And that raises the inevitable question. Has God finally just rejected his people?
That is exactly the question Paul asks in the very first verse of chapter 11. I ask then, has God rejected his people?
And spoiler alert.
Genoito. By no means.
But we will have to wait for the next deep dive to see how he pulls that theological rabbit out of the hat.
Here is a final thought for you to chew on before we go. Paul leaves us with that lingering image of God, holding his hands out to a people who keep saying no. It makes you ask, is God's sovereignty somehow limited by human stubbornness? Or is his stubborn, relentless love actually a part of his sovereignty?
That is definitely something to mull over. Thanks for diving deep with us. Keep reading, keep thinking.
See you next time.